Welcome, everyone. My name is Michał Baranowski, and I'm a director of the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund. It's fantastic to have you all with us, both the panelists and all the participants on the other side of the camera or the screen. It's great to have you join our discussion about the future of NATO and NATO's new chapter under Biden presidency. It's an exciting time to be talking about NATO, just a day after the NATO ministerial, day after the NATO 2030 report has been published. Well, I'm actually not counting very clearly, but we are just over a month and a half from January 20th, when President-elect Biden will take over. And we have great panelists that to join us today. Stan Sloan, he's a fellow at Atlantic Council, but very importantly for our meeting today, especially an author of the book "Defense of the West: Transatlantic Security from Truman to Trump." Sorry. And he will provide us with his depth of expertise goes also into the long history of the alliance, and we are certainly in a very important junction, given the last 4 years, and we'll come back to this. And we are also joined by Danielle Piatkiewicz, a fellow at the Europeum Institute. And Danielle, it's also a great pleasure to have Danielle as an alumnus of GMF, including GMF Warsaw. So it's great, Danielle, to have you back with us virtually. So we are meeting today just day after the NATO 2030 report has been published, and it was really a moment in the alliance history where it was not very clear how the alliance would fare if President Trump had 4 more years, and that there are quite high hopes of the Biden administration. It's not been the easiest 4 years for the alliance. We all remember comments about NATO being obsolete, questioning the Article 5, and really putting a very deep emphasis on burden sharing, which is not new, but in a very new and tough style. And on our side of the Atlantic, we are actually meeting just about on an anniversary or soon after the comments about NATO's brain death. So we are here to discuss whether we are at a new opening, a new dawn, a new chapter, and what are the challenges ahead of NATO, what are the opportunities with Biden's administration, but what are the continuations as well that we might likely to see between Trump and Biden. All right, without further ado, let me open up with a question to Stan, and really invite Stan to jump in and give us both the historical perspective on the alliance and the moment we are in at the moment in this history, and your now that we know that it's actually Biden's team who's going to take over, your expectations of the president-elect and where you think he will like to take United States within the North Atlantic Alliance. Stan, over to you.
Thank you, Michał, and Danielle, good to be with you and good to be with everyone who's online watching today. I am going to talk first a little bit about the history of the background to this book, and then talk a little bit about some of the substance of the conclusions of this current book, and then talk about the 2030 report and some of the implications for the future. The foundation for this new book was built in 1984 in my book titled NATO's Future: Toward a New Transatlantic Bargain. The term transatlantic bargain, as all of you know, was crafted by Harlan Cleveland, who was the US permanent representative to the North Atlantic Council from 1965 to 1969. My 1984 book added the word new. The new part was what many people talk about today in referring to a new transatlantic bargain. In 1984, I wrote, and this is from the book in 1984, quote, "The new bargain must bring greater European responsibility and leadership to the deal. It must ensure continued American involvement in European defense, while at the same time constructing a new European pillar inside, not outside, the broad framework of the Western Alliance. The new bargain requires evolutionary, not revolutionary change. NATO must remain able to serve the fundamental purposes for which it was designed, and the bargain must bring together Europe's full potential, attracting the active participation of France, West Germany, and Great Britain, while benefiting from the substantial combined assets of the other West European allies." As I read from my 1984 book, I'm struck by how this echoes again today when people talk about a new transatlantic bargain, and it even echoes in the 2030 report that was just released yesterday. To begin the process, I suggested in 1984 that the European allies should produce what I call the European Security Assessment, which would assess from a European perspective the threats to their interests and the necessary responses. A few years later, in 1987, the members of the Western European Union produced what they called the Hague Platform on European Security Interests, which was very much like what I had proposed in terms of European security assessment. As I had predicted in 1984, the assessment did not differ substantially from assessments done by NATO in the same time frame, thus perhaps being somewhat reassuring to the United States about whether Europeans will go off in some kind of crazy direction doing things on their own. With a total of 5 books over the years, the 1984 volume has grown into the book we're discussing today. When the last updates were made to the text in the spring of this year, it was unclear whether there would be a new, more NATO-friendly American administration or if the Trump administration might be returned to power. I therefore included an analysis of potential futures that I had presented in Europe on several occasions. The first presentation was in Vienna in September of last year at an event hosted by the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. The most notable appearance of the text came when the US ambassador to Denmark, a Trump supporter, blocked my presentation to a celebration of NATO's 70th anniversary scheduled to be held in Copenhagen almost exactly a year ago. The meeting was canceled on short notice when many Danes objected to my being excluded from the event. Then, with the US Embassy removed from the picture, I was invited to Copenhagen in March of this year to present the talk that I was prevented from delivering in December. In that speech and in the book, I suggested 3 broad possibilities for the future of the transatlantic alliance. I constructed them simply to stimulate thought, not to predict or advocate. My basic assumption was that a healthy, functioning transatlantic relationship is a good thing. All 3 of my scenarios assumed that Russia would continue to pose political and military challenges while its economy was weakening. The threat of terrorist attacks would persist. There would be growing concern about Chinese power, but at the same time, continuing financial and economic cooperation between NATO allies and China. And I assumed that the UK would indeed leave the European Union. The first scenario I called substantial continuity. In this potential future, little actually changes from the long history of the transatlantic relationship. The United States in this scenario remains committed to participate in the defense of Europe, to deploy substantial numbers of troops in Europe, and to retain military leadership of NATO, with the senior American general serving as NATO's supreme allied commander. In this scenario, post-Trump administrations try to repair damage done to US leadership of the alliance without abandoning US burden-sharing concerns. All current allies remain in the alliance, despite some wavering by Turkey, for example, and others experimenting with forms of democracy that do not conform to liberal democratic values. With the United Kingdom having abandoned EU membership, the EU continues modest attempts to give the Union a more substantial integrated military capacity. The UK makes some cooperative military arrangements with its former EU partners while seeking a continued special relationship with the United States. In this potential future, several allies spend around 2% of their gross domestic product on defense by 2024, as was agreed at the 2014 Wales Summit, while others fall short. The second scenario I called radical positive change. In this future, the goal of a more balanced transatlantic relationship comes more clearly into view. In other words, moving toward the new transatlantic bargain I had advocated in 1984. The United States remains committed to the alliance in this scenario, while supporting European efforts to take on more burdens and responsibilities in the alliance. The EU members make substantial advances in coordinating and even integrating their defense establishments. A true European army controlled by a politically united Europe remains out of reach, but all EU members increasingly sacrifice bits of their national control in a variety of pragmatic cooperative arrangements. The UK, despite its departure from the EU, commits to thorough defense cooperation with EU members while remaining fully committed to NATO. Increased European defense spending is accompanied by revitalization of the European defense industry with multinational firms and co-production arrangements setting up a healthy competition across the Atlantic. At the same time, the US-European competition for sales and military equipment is moderated by better transatlantic defense industrial cooperation, something that was being advocated way back in the 1970s. The stronger European contribution to defense is acknowledged by alternating European and American Supreme Allied commanders as a transition to a possible future in which Europeans would routinely hold this post. The role of Secretary General also alternates between prominent European and North American political leaders. That was the radical positive change scenario. Finally, I imagined a scenario of radical negative change. This scenario presents a much darker future. In it, the United States essentially abandons its transatlantic commitments and leadership roles. The European allies fall into disputes about how to maintain their security and provide new leadership. I suggested such a scenario could begin with the re-election of Donald Trump. In this hypothetical scenario, Trump continues the process of abandoning US international leadership and decides to remove all US forces from Europe. Trump announces that he and Vladimir Putin have agreed that the removal of US forces from Europe would promote peace and security in Europe. In response, European allies discuss creating strong, integrated European defense structures to replace the transatlantic NATO ones, but they find it too challenging politically and financially. Several member countries suggest that the EU should follow the US lead and sign a peaceful relations accord with Russia, in which both sides pledge to take no aggressive actions against the other. Some commentators immediately label this, quote, the 21st century Munich, but most European governments decide they have little choice. In addition, this move toward accommodation with Russia strengthens illiberal pro-Moscow parties throughout Europe. This leads to the election of several national administrations that lean toward fascist forms of governance and away from liberal democracy. Today, we know we don't face this radical negative scenario, fortunately. Trump lost, Joe Biden won, and his presidency could be consistent with either of the two more optimistic scenarios. Which do I think is most likely at this point in history? The substantial continuity model still seems most likely, although some elements of the radical positive scenario could appear. And the radical negative scenario is worth keeping in mind as what we Atlanticists will want to avoid in the future. It is important for Europeans and Americans to remember the consequences or potential consequences of a future Trump leading the United States. The bottom line is that in democracies, the future remains ours to determine. So far, even with all the shortcomings of current transatlantic security relationships, nobody has come up with a compelling alternative. That observation was reinforced by yesterday's release of the Reflection Group report on NATO 2030, which concluded that, quote, NATO remains indispensable. Every major examination of NATO's health, from the Three Wise Men in 1956 to the Harmel exercise in 1967 to the latest strategic concept in 2010, has recommended improving consultations among the allies. That is like the good thing that has always been agreed on and not necessarily always accomplished. This report echoes that familiar call. Perhaps most importantly, the report issues a strong call for the allies to defend the values that underlie the alliance. It warns against the dangers of authoritarian tendencies. The report, very diplomatically, does not identify alliance members whose values have been endangered. But the unwritten country names undoubtedly include Turkey, Hungary, Poland, and indeed the United States during the Trump presidency. All of those challenges were mentioned explicitly in my book, which is why it is titled Defense of the West. Well, I'll stop there and look forward to Danielle's observations and Michał's comments and those from the audience as well. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stan, for putting it in a nice and large perspective. And in fact, it is striking that the challenges that we are facing in terms of the mechanics of the alliance are very much similar now as they were in 1984. Though I think it would be important for us to go back to the debates that we are having right now about European strategic autonomy, and also certainly we should focus to what extent China's rise and competition between US and China, or the West and China, impacts also alliance, because this is of course a prominent part of the NATO 2030 report. Let me turn to Danielle. Danielle, for your thoughts, to some extent, also, you know, if you wish to jump in with any reactions to what Stan said, and then we're gonna have a bit of a discussion among us. But I already see that questions are coming in, including one from Ambassador of Italy to Poland. So we'll turn to questions very soon as well. All right, Danielle, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, thank you for Michał for having me here today. Back at my old stomping grounds. First started in Warsaw, I think over 7 years ago. So this is full circle. Great to be back. So I'm delighted to be here today to discuss this incredibly important topic and timely topic. I had the pleasure of reading Stan's book this past week, and congratulations. It's a fantastic account of not just the history of and evolution of NATO, but also of the transatlantic relationship. It really stresses that while NATO has had its ups and downs, what remains vital to the transatlantic relationship is the steadfast focus on values that created NATO, which I think we all need to be reminded of, especially as we emerge from a global pandemic and 4 years of US leadership questioning and challenging some of these values, specifically on securing democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law. But as Michał mentioned, I'll focus a little bit more today on the recent developments in light of US transition towards a Biden administration, with a focus a little bit also on Central and Eastern Europe, and touch on the short and long-term challenges and opportunities of NATO, which have actually been nicely framed and timely framed in the NATO 2030 report that came out this week. So looking at the short-term future of NATO, it will be no surprise that a Biden administration will look to recommit to engaging with democratic partners, including the EU, on global issues, placing an emphasis on strengthening instead of weakening the institutions that have helped build and protect today's liberal international order. Biden has advocated for strengthening NATO's security relations ever since his time as VP, and has actually pushed for the US to continue a strong role in his leadership. He also outlined this in his campaign goals and actually reiterated in the last couple of weeks to renew democracy and alliances, placing America back at the head of the table to help with most urgent global challenges, investment in NATO's military and expand its capacity on threats such as cybersecurity, terrorism, and also climate-related threats, Also urging nations to join in tackling these global issues by reaching out to allies in Asia, South America, including specifically Australia, Japan, South Korea, all vital in countering geopolitical threats such as Russia and China. But at the same time, the US, like most countries, will focus on internal issues in the immediate future, including post-COVID economic recovery, repairing the overstretched healthcare system, not to mention bridging the domestic divide and essentially cleaning up a little bit after Trump, especially on its external relations. But it's important to stress that the policy issues that drove a wedge between Europe and Trump's America will not simply disappear overnight. The buildup over the last 4 years have been an accumulation of policy and security tensions rooted both in new and old security challenges, including the dreaded 2% debate, sorry to bring it up, which was emphasized in the book. Thank you, Stan. And it was not emphasized as not being the only time that in NATO's history that the US flagged and questioned Europe's contribution towards security and defense investment. Just looking back at the debate in the 90s and the early 2000s, the US wanted Europe to do a little bit more quantitative measures and also show their commitment towards global security. And today, while the US will recommit towards multilateralism, there will still require Europe to take a stronger role and continue to invest in its own security and defense capabilities. And that's actually something that Europe has done in the last 4 years. It led Europe to develop new defense initiatives, including EDF, PESCO, CARD, among others, all aimed to help Europe invest, adapt, and develop these capabilities, and also work towards a strategic compass aimed to redefine EU security and defense policy and accelerate efforts to help deepen EU defense cooperation. While strategic autonomy may be a long-term objective, there is more political support growing and gaining for which is actually causing a bit of a rift within Europe for those who rely heavily on US engagement, including Central and Eastern Europe, who are still keen on the US security and nuclear umbrella as a buffer towards their eastern flank. And Biden has actually recently called for more cooperation in the Central and Eastern Europe region, asking for continued support in NATO, the continued development of the region's defense capabilities, prioritizing 3Cs initiative, and also earlier criticized US withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty, which we can assume there would be some re-engagement on that front. But as Stan alluded earlier, the kind of wave of illiberal trends, something that you actually build up into your last chapter as possibly being a destabilizing factor in the alliance, will definitely be an issue for this region, as deterioration of democratic processes and rule of law in areas, and like you mentioned, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, will have to reevaluate their posture to adhere to a more pro-democratic policies that a Biden administration will certainly call for. But looking forward within NATO, implemented last year, actually around this time during the London meeting, NATO 2030 was established to help look at renewed external threats, but also to help further strengthen NATO's political dimension, to reinforce alliance's unity, increase political consultation and coordination between allies. And as already mentioned, this week the report came out, and one of the first aspects is, of course, updating the strategic concept from 2010, identifying emerging and disruptive technologies, but also looking for ways for NATO to look politically and to become a bit more competent in handling and tackling Russia and China as they rise on the global scale, to help safeguard global arms control and other global challenges like the pandemic to climate change. Secondly, NATO will need to stay strong militarily by maintaining its commitments and by elevating its resilience, which should not only rely on military power, but also on building strong digital infrastructure. Finally, NATO will need to cooperate more with like-minded partners and look at NATO +4 format, looking at Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. So as you can see, many of these points are in line with what the US administration wants to focus on in regards to foreign policy and NATO engagement. And this gives me hope that Stan's predictions of a substantial continuity and radical positive change are hopefully the direction we go. But I'd be remiss if I didn't flag some of the long-term challenges, short and long-term challenges that could be anywhere from the Iran nuclear deal, rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan, the European autonomy debates. A divided Congress will also likely cause issues on how US can commit to various NATO projects and multilateral agreements, dealing with Brexit and countering the economic and security challenges post-pandemic. So not to leave on such a negative note, but I know we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of these issues. So back to you, Michał.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and very interesting tidbits to jump to and expand on. But it is interesting how you're pointing out that the also NATO 2030 report fits pretty well with where the Biden's administration is talking about going. I actually, because we are having a number of very good questions, I'm going to jump in right into questions, and I'm going to read them out, paraphrase to some extent. But both of you mentioned the importance of values for the alliance, and in fact, I was also struck reading the NATO 2030 report how often those were referred to throughout the report. I didn't do a word search, but it was very extensive. So one of the questions we have is from Ambassador Amati. I'm going to read it quickly. The creeping isolationism of the last US administration and the necessity to concentrate on the internal situation will have an important impact on NATO. One question is, what are the theaters that you think NATO will be taking more responsibilities for? And apropos values, how much is Turkey a problem inside NATO? How about we take this one really quickly, because the other ones are on other subjects. Stanley, you want to take a stab at this, and then perhaps Danielle?
Sure, I'd be happy to start out, and also to hear Danielle's response as well. I would quibble a little bit with the terminology and the question. I know that the Trump years have been seen as American isolationism. I tend to see them much more as American unilateralism. We had this discussion when George Bush came to office as well, and there was a tendency to see his approach as being isolationist. I always saw it as unilateralist, and that's how I see the Trump years. He, in some ways, it can be looked at as isolationist, but I think it's much more prominently unilateralist. The America First approach was a strongly unilateral approach. Let me just say that I think that President Biden will take us beyond this. If you look at American public opinion over even in the depth of the Trump administration, you'll see that Americans remain very internationally positive in terms of US involvement in the world, very positive toward Europe, very positive toward NATO. That leads me to believe that with the right kind of leadership at the top in the United States, we will not see a wave of isolationism. We will see an attitude in the Biden administration that he will call America together with other countries and inside the United States together as a nation more united. Well, I think we're going to see a different approach that will change the vector, and I think that there is a good chunk of public opinion that will be willing to follow this lead by the administration. Turkey is a very difficult problem, and there are certainly plenty of people, experts in the United States, who would like to see Turkey kicked out of the alliance. We know that that's not possible. That's not provided for in the North Atlantic Treaty. And I think in any case, it would be unwise. There will be a Turkey beyond Erdogan, is the way that I like to look at it. Turkey has great geopolitical, geostrategic importance for the alliance and for everything that goes on in that region. And I think, therefore, while we should be critical, and I think the Biden administration will be critical of the Erdogan regime in terms of its commitment to democracy and human rights. But on the other hand, I think the administration will try to find ways to encourage Turkey to move back toward the values that are underlined, written in the preface of the North Atlantic Treaty. So let me leave it at that, and I look forward to Danielle's response.
Yeah. I definitely agree with you, Stan, on those points. It's going to be an area that, I mean, Biden's already been calling for, the upholding democracy from around the world. And I think if within the alliance, if there are outliers, it will become more noticeable and it's already emerging and happening at the moment. So I think kind of to stay within the game, people are going to have to, or countries are going to have to start to really reevaluate how they want to fit in this this bigger picture and collaborate within a Biden administration. But on the NATO side, one term that actually stood out to me in the report was they considered, the drift kind of towards disunity can actually be could be seen as strategic rather than a tactical problem, is something that they listed. And I thought that was incredibly interesting, that I think for the first time in a while, they're actually owning the differences and understanding that every country is going to have, of course, different perspectives. We see this right now in the European autonomy debate, where obviously people want to have, or countries want to have stronger defense within Europe, but then also, you have a lot of players saying that they want a stronger and continue to have a strong transatlantic relationship. So I think having these differences are actually, NATO starting to look at this could be a positive side, because it pushes the alliance to adapt. And that's what we see with this report, but also what we're going to see next year at the summit.
Danielle, you mentioned the debate over European strategic autonomy, and there is a question from Ambassador Darius Samaska, Ambassador at Large at the MFA of Lithuania. He asked about, could you comment on the tsunami of the European sovereignty? Give us a little bit of your view on this. It's certainly, I would agree with the ambassador that this is a debate that on one hand has been going on for a bit some time, but it has been reignited by Biden, and in a way, maybe it was be even stronger if it was Trump. But how real is it? And Stan, over to you after Danielle. You mentioned some of the same dilemmas way back when. So how real is this debate, or how ideological it would be? So Danielle, how about we start with you first?
Yeah, I'm actually going to say that after reading Stan's book, it reassures me that this is not a one-off situation, that this debate has been going on kind of, in ebb and flows. So that's reassuring, I would say, and that the alliance has been able to endure all these different changes. But I think what we saw, maybe in just the last couple of weeks, is potentially, I would say, almost a backlash against knowing that Biden wants to come back at that head of the table. I think Europe kind of saw itself emerging as a stronger, defense entity. By creating all these fantastic programs that I think have actually really moved the bar. And I don't think we want to lose that momentum. And so maybe there's a little bit of fear. And so having this backlash to something positive. But I think once we get over this kind of, little growing pain, I think perhaps we can kind of look forward to seeing what the alliance can do together. And I think post-January, the debate might be different.
Thanks. Stan?
The main thing I think we'll see is the Biden administration getting back to the table, because in many ways the Trump administration and the president left the table. And when the United States is back at the table, I see it as a situation where the United States has to earn the seat at the head of the table. I think under Biden, it will earn the seat at the head of the table. The debate over European autonomy, and it is a historic one, and the term autonomy always strikes some concern in the United States because it implies a division within the transatlantic relationship. It's always been that way from the beginning. That's been a concern. That's one reason why in 1984 I suggested it would be important to build the European pillar inside the transatlantic alliance, not outside it. That still is the concern today. I have an interesting perspective perhaps on what the Obama administration did that I think the Biden administration should avoid. The Obama administration tended to have too strong a belief that the Europeans would be able to unify to the point of presenting a much more cohesive, autonomous approach to their responsibilities in the alliance. I'm more skeptical about this, just as the Trump administration was very negative about dealing with Europe. I think the Biden administration should avoid being too optimistic about what Europeans can do. We've already seen in response to the pandemic and in many other areas that divisions among European states are still very real and stand in the way of the kind of extensive cooperation that would produce anything like a Europe of defense, which to my mind can only happen after there is a political unification of Europe. And so we need to be, and I hope the Biden administration will be modest in terms of its expectations while pushing for a variety of approaches of bilateral cooperation, European Union programs and so forth that can enhance Europe's role in the alliance without creating any kind of an autonomous pillar outside of the transatlantic alliance.
Very interesting. I mean, especially given that whether it's Biden's or somebody else's America, that this America will need able partners, which doesn't necessarily mean autonomous, but with responsibilities and capabilities. But I think the expectation in Europe is certainly that Biden's administration will not be as allergic as Trump's administration to European cooperation also on security and defense. We have lots of good questions coming, so I'll just keep them coming. I might group them a little bit because we have a question from Plamen Pantev, who says hi to you, Stan, and he asks about your assessment of Biden's administration in Southeast Europe, Black Sea. And I would add to this perhaps the question from a colleague in Georgia about, I lost it, but it's basically Biden's administration regarding NATO's enlargement to Georgia. I was, for example, very struck. I don't know if you share this, how low priority the NATO 2030 report paid to NATO's open door policy. So your take on this, maybe starting with Stan.
On the question of Georgia, I'm afraid that the question of membership in NATO for both Georgia and Ukraine will be ones that will not be at the top of the agenda for the Biden administration. They have enough difficult issues to deal with that I suspect that the administration will not repeat the mistake made by the Bush administration toward the end of its second term when it said pushed for the alliance and got agreement of the allies to say that the two countries would eventually become NATO members. That was, I think, a strategic error, and I doubt that the Biden administration will make the same mistake. At the same time, I expect the Biden administration to develop as much cooperation, positive cooperation with both Ukraine and Georgia, try to support the process of economic reform and democratization in both of those countries, leaving the door open, but not one that's likely to allow them to walk through any time in the near future. The first part of the question, I guess, or the first question was about the people that Biden is bringing into key positions in his administration. And I think that you can count on the team that he is assembling being very supportive of all of his instincts. And those are all quite clearly on the record with some articles that have been published over the past year about Biden's approach to foreign policy, his track record over the years. And he has assembled what I think most people believe is a very, very talented team. I was struck by the comment that President Obama made about the new National Security Advisor designate Jake Sullivan in saying that he was wicked smart, and wicked is a term that we use up here in New England to describe someone who really is very smart. So that was a great compliment from Obama. The respect that is out there for Tony Blinken is clear. there are very few people who find negative things to say about him. Well, I think, and you go down through the rest of the team that has been announced so far, it's a very strong team and one that I think is very consistent with the record that Biden has established on foreign policy.
Thank you. Danielle?
Just to add a little bit to that, maybe on the Georgia front and also open door policy would be, while it might not be on the first priority and maybe on both accounts on NATO and Biden, but I think Biden will also recall what happened during Obama administration with Ukraine and Crimea and seeing that the ramifications and the fact that it did create an emboldened Russia could also be still a warning sign, and perhaps this is still in the back of the mind when it comes to certain policies. And I think they will see that with supporting more infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe. I don't think that's going to go away. So I think on that front, there'll still be a continued engagement in the region in some way or form.
Great, thank you very much, Danielle. Let me and keep them coming, guys. The questions that are great, and hopefully we'll get to all of them. But I wanna group them tiny bit. There's a question from Dieter Detke on Russia, and specifically on nuclear challenges from Russia. Is arms control the answer, or does NATO need new nuclear capabilities? I wanted to tiny bit enlarge it as well, and maybe I'll start with you, Danielle, on the level of deterrence that we have right now. Your assessment of if we are, the last 6 years, really since 2014, has been very much focused on adaptation of NATO on the eastern flank of the alliance. At the same time, Russia is going through a very fast military modernization process, standing up a division level forces on northeastern flank. So while the architecture is falling apart. So, you can comment on the nuclear piece, or you can comment on more of the level of deterrence that we have specifically on the east, and then we would go to Stan.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, on the deterrence side, it's an area that I think I had alluded to it earlier, that there is still a heavy reliance on kind of the U.S. nuclear umbrella, while EU is still trying to create some form of that and trying to build up the capabilities along the east. I think it's not going to get to a point where we can't have that strong transatlantic input and resources. I think it could be linked to more kind of EDF funding or additional PESCO projects. I think this could be an avenue to kind of help foster that. And I think as we see countries maybe looking at more internal and domestic recovery, reminding us that through some of these kind of investments, it can also help bolster and drive some economic fostering. So I think on that front, it's something that this region still needs to continue to invest in. But I don't think it's going to be, I guess, solved anytime soon, but it's still very much clear and present. But I think the continued support on open skies is something that the EU, as you saw, step up. And then also just on treaties in general, helping support, continued support on Iran. I think there's still hope that the US will re-engage at some form there. So I think EU really took, European allies within NATO really took the flag to try to continue this effort. So I think that should definitely continue, but then also look at ways to help create their own infrastructure and maybe in step with the United States.
Thank you. Stan?
I think perhaps the most important thing to say is that in response to Dieter's question, is that the Biden administration most likely, given the fact that the New START is about to run out in February, one of the first things it will do is seek to establish an extension of New START with Russia, and to provide that a 5-year period in which the two countries could talk about ways of improving, reforming, and strengthening the treaty. And I think that that's what my expectation. I could be wrong, but that's my expectation, the approach that the administration will take on arms control. In that discussion during that extended period, there obviously will be a discussion of intermediate range missiles and the challenges posed by the new Russian systems. I think that the tendency of the Biden administration will try to resolve some of the issues through negotiation. They will be handicapped in terms of developing new systems to deploy by financial limitations on American defense spending, which we know will be real. But we also know that there are handicaps that faced by the Russians as well. There may be some self-interested on the part of the Russians to go with the extension and to make the negotiating process something that is real and important again. There's the question, of course, of whether China should be included in this process. I tend to see China as a little bit of a separate issue. They do not have the same level of nuclear systems as do Russia and the United States. But it would be very helpful, obviously, to get them involved in some kind of a dialogue on nuclear weapons. It's a little bit treacherous for the United States to do that because China's position is most logically to say that they are so much smaller in terms of nuclear capability than the United States that perhaps the United States and Russia need to come down a long ways before it's relevant for China to participate. Another interesting angle here, another reason why the United States and Europe can't take a totally negative approach to China. There are lots of reasons for not being able to do that. We do have some mutual dependencies with China in terms of trade and financial relationships. But another consideration is that in terms of dealing with the nuclear threat from Korea, which at least in the near term is much more destabilizing and dangerous than China, we could use Chinese assistance in putting pressure on North Korea to try to get them to take a more positive attitude toward denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But a lot of interactive parts here that the Biden administration will have to manage. But I think the first step will be seeking an extension of the New START agreement.
Stan, let me follow up on this because you also mentioned China, and we'll go to China in a second. We absolutely have to. But I mean, you're describing your expectations as a 5-year extension. For some observers, for example, here, this would actually suggest a willingness of Biden's administration to seek a broader opening with Russia to sort of give space for number of topics to be discussed. What would be your take on? I mean, you said 5 years. That's I think an important point. But what would be the U.S.-Russia framework in which you would expect Biden's administration to operate to start with, beyond the extension of the START treaty?
I think the Biden administration approach will be very much along Harmel lines, in that the administration will not be reluctant to criticize Putin and his form of governance and his approach to human rights and democracy, but at the same time will seek cooperation where cooperation is possible. And arms control is an area where not only it may be possible, but it also could be very necessary for international stability in the interest of the United States and in the interest of Russia. And so the 5-year number is just one that I've seen discussed. It's not one that I've come up with. I think it offers a reasonable time period to project out discussions, negotiations, and so I think that the Biden administration will pursue something like a policy of cooperating where possible and competing or criticizing where necessary. And they will try to walk that fine line that keeps the cooperative aspects alive while not backing away from criticism.
And I'll just quickly add to that. I mean, I don't foresee any form of reset policy by no means, but I think the difference in this Biden administration will be that fact that we'll work closer with our allies on countering Russia. And I think that's going to be key and very stark difference between this administration and the previous one.
I think, could I just add to that? I agree completely, because the underlying assumption of the Biden administration foreign policy is that you start out by cooperating, working with allies, with our democratic friends and allies in Europe and Asia. And that is the very beginning point for the Biden foreign policy. And it certainly applies in terms of arms control and military issues. But in general, this is why the administration is expected right away to rejoin the World Health Organization, to get back into discussions about the Iran nuclear accord. All of these things, the starting point for the administration is working with allies.
Thank you both. All right, let's do China, because it's obviously a super important topic. There is a question from Krzysztof Zalewski. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. And Krzysztof is a good friend and he's dealing with China. He's basically asking whether we have a consensus within the alliance on China and Russia, but let's take China as a threat. This was also a big topic in the NATO 2030 report. It's a recommendation number 3, and certainly something that it's a big part of debate over since really last year. In London, it was mentioned for the first time. So and Krzysztof is asking about also NATO's responsibility in the Indo-Pacific. But let me not go only into whether we're gonna see anytime soon NATO flag flying over freedom of navigation operations, but more about how does NATO deal with China, to what extent we have a consensus within the alliance, what the alliance should be doing about China. Let me start with Stan and go to Danielle, and then we'll try to squeeze maybe a couple or last question, because we are almost out of time. Stan, NATO.
Yes, very quickly. I think the Biden administration will try to promote some kind of a Harmel for China, and on this basis try to develop some kind of consensus among the allies. There isn't, I think, anything that you could describe it as a consensus so far. In a year ago, at least the alliance mentioned China as a topic of concern. I think the Biden administration will try to develop a consensus. And again, I think it will probably be along the lines of acknowledging that there are areas in which all of us, Europeans and Americans alike, need to cooperate with China, but there are other areas where we need to push back. And that's why I think that, and you're talking not just about trade and intellectual property, we're talking also about military issues around Taiwan and South China Sea and all of that. And in fact, in my Middlebury College course that I'm teaching starting in January, I'm going to do a role-playing exercise that raises exactly that question for the students of what kind of consensus they can come up with on a NATO policy toward China.
Thanks. Danielle?
I would add that there's a consensus that there is no consensus on China. I think what we see is, and especially in the NATO 2030 report, that here are all the different things that China is emerging as a threat. It might not be as a traditional security threat, even though that's something that is changing. But I think one thing that was agreed upon is that the merging in disruptive technologies, cyber attacks, disinformation, these are things which are, of course, rooted to then the NATO values. That is what we agree that is a challenge. But I think we have to still look at the political perception of China versus the economic. And I think that's where the EU is not aligned on. But I think on NATO terms, they see what are the challenges, because these are some challenges that, and as Stan quoted, that China wasn't even mentioned in the 2010, and actually the 2030 report actually says China wasn't even on our radar, essentially, in these lights and these frames. And I think that is something that is changing. and where we see some consensus. But on the US side, I agree. I think they'll be still kind of in line with how Biden will emerge and deal with Russia, in the sense that still obviously have to be a partner in some sense. They'll still utilize our international partners and allies to try to help counter China. And I think he'll still actually be very tough on China, especially as they continue to emerge as a geopolitical threat.
Great, thanks. Okay, we are nearing the end. We have a couple other really good questions. There are more also questions from Mr. Rosenitz about competition with China in Africa, competition with China in our neighborhood, and you can come back to this as well. But there are two other very specific questions, and they are really about expectations of US under Biden's engagement. One is in Europe. Henry Kraft is asking about Trump's decision to withdraw troops from Germany. He's wondering whether you think Biden will go along or whether he will have second thoughts or reverse this decision. And the second question is about Afghanistan, whether Biden's administration would continue withdrawing troops. How about we start with Danielle, and also if you have any last sort of thoughts, and then we'll finish with Stan, and maybe you can take the Germany and Afghanistan, but sort of in a broader take on U.S. engagement under Biden and perhaps also beyond. Danielle, over to you.
Yeah, so the Afghanistan and also the Germany component, I'm going to almost put those together in the sense that I think we're all a little bit on hold. I think we're going to see if any of this can be reversed, and if so, to what extent. I know we've seen reports that Biden's definitely not in line with this, nor is kind of emerging security advisors. This is something that I think a lot of people are against. For the Germany component, there might still be some reshuffling, but I think that will also be in response to the needs for more of Central and Eastern Europe, perhaps still transfer to Poland. I think that's still going to be on the table, but to what degree will the full reducement be in Germany? I think that's still to be determined. Now in Afghanistan, the rapid reduction would be, I mean, on my side, incredibly detrimental to kind of the entire policy out there. And I think that's something we'll have to try to backpedal. And if we can, how much can we do, and what can still be made until the end of, I would say, mid-January. I know this also puts EU allies in a difficult position, because they actually still do want to stay engaged, because they know what's going to happen. And I think the last 2 decades of engagement in this region to just withdraw rapidly would be, as I mentioned, detrimental. So I think there's still hope that some of this will be reversed and or navigated differently.
Thank you. Stan.
Yeah, I think that the initial actions of the Biden administration will be to put a freeze on these troop withdrawals that Trump really threw into the hopper as a troublemaking move at the end of his administration. This is fully recognized by the Biden people. At the same time, they understand that there may be some awkwardness in being seen as redeploying or deploying more troops to Europe or to Afghanistan. But I think that they will deal with this issue. They'll freeze the operations. I think that Germany, and from the point of view of the Biden people, is a critically important ally, and that there will be in-depth, frank discussions with the German government about how to handle the presence of the United States in Germany, and they will come out with perhaps some positive discussions that will even feed positively into the burden sharing formula. I think that is one of the possible courses. I think that the Biden people will not want to abandon the anti-terrorism role of American and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And so there'll be reconsideration of the moves there as well. For sort of my final words on the 2030 report, I'm just very happy to see 2 things that are important themes in that report. One is the importance of adaptation. I've emphasized that in my books and my writings and lecturing over all these years. And the second is the importance of values. If, say, Danielle, having just read my book, knows that one of the key themes in the book is the importance of NATO as a political, not just a military alliance. I always have to tell my students that a lot of people say NATO is just a military alliance, but that is a complete misunderstanding of the alliance because it is very political. It does stand on an ideology of liberal democracy, and that foundation remains critically important for the future of the alliance. So I was very happy to see those themes coming into the 2030 report, and hopefully they will also be strongly influential and reflected concept the alliance will now take on, which allies did not want to do during the Trump administration, fearing what might come out of that process.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stan. This was a very good sort of last message, because the 2021, when finally 2020 is over, will be very much a year of NATO, with the Stoltenberg already inviting President-elect Biden to a NATO summit. A bit of a recommitment, perhaps, from the US, and a beginning of a conversation about new strategic concept, which was, as you said, a #1 recommendation from the NATO 2030 report. Thank you all who joined us, who are with us on the other side of the screen. I also wanted to thank the Warsaw team, Boris, Monica, and Marta, who are preparing this and who are online. Danielle, it's fantastic to have you with us virtually in Warsaw, and as you said, you were starting here 7 years. That's hard to believe. And Stan, it's great to have you with us from North England. And for anyone who hasn't done it, please go and buy Stan's book, Defense of the West: Transatlantic Security from Truman to Trump. And you can learn more about what Biden is going to do as well.
It'll make a great Christmas present.
A great Christmas present. That's right. That's right. Christmas is coming. All right. Thank you all. See you next time, and have a good rest of the day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.